History books teach us that the Harlem Renaissance was just a random explosion of black expression and art. They make it sound like everyone held hands, played jazz, and white folks stood up and clapped. But that's a lie. The Harlem Renaissance was actually highly planned and heavily funded. We weren't just here to entertain the world. We proved that we could create art and took over the global culture. But like any good story, it destroyed itself from the inside. So join us today while we talk about how we built the Harlem Renaissance and took control of our image. This is One Mic Black History. I'm your host, Country Boy. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com, and you can also find me on Substack. But without further ado, let's get started. If you've been following the channel, you already know the story of Philip A. Payton. We talked about how a black real estate agent took over empty white luxury buildings in early 1900. He turned white desperation against him and rented those buildings at a high price to black tenants, fought off a white real estate mob, and essentially evicted white folks from Harlem. But getting into the buildings was just the first step. Owning the physical block means nothing if you don't own your own story. Once we secured the real estate, we had to go to war for our image in the eyes of the country. See, by the early 1900s, the American establishment looked at black people as dangerous but highly profitable. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson screened The Birth of a Nation at the White House. It wasn't just a movie, it was the first blockbuster in American history. It praised the Ku Klux Klan. It pushed the old Negro stereotype to the world. This lie that black people were uneducated, less than human, and incapable of building a civilization. It wasn't just insulting, it was a weapon. If the government convinced the white public that black folks were less than human, they could easily justify Jim Crow, lynchings, and shutting them out of the American economy completely without guilt. But things were starting to change during the Red Summer of 1919. Over 350,000 black soldiers returned from fighting in World War I. They had bled for democracy overseas, learned how to use weapons, and absolutely refused to accept white terrorism at home. When white mobs attacked black neighborhoods in over 36 cities, black veterans didn't turn the other cheek. They barricaded their street, they posted snipers on the roof, and they fired back. Jamaican-born poet Claude McKay captured this exact fighting spirit in his legendary poem, If We Must Die, writing that, like men, we will face the murderous, cowardly pack. Pressed against the wall, dying, we must fight back. The old Negro died in the streets of Chicago and Washington, D.C. We had this militant energy, but black leaders knew that the courtrooms and politicians were completely rigged against us. To change our image in the eyes of the world, we couldn't just use bullets. We needed a new weapon to destroy this stereotype from the inside out. That weapon was undeniable black genius. Enter Alain, Locke, and Charles S. Johnson. History would tell you that they're just scholars, but in reality, they were masterminds behind the Harlem Renaissance. Their strategy was very simple. They were going to use high culture, books, fine art, theater, to force the white establishment to recognize black genius. In 1920, high art was the ultimate test for human civilization. If we could prove that we were equals on the canvas, the excuses of Jim Crow would fall apart. They would execute this plan March 21st, 1924, at the Civic Club dinner in Manhattan. Johnson invited the most powerful white publishers to New York, the heads of Harper and Brothers, Macmillan, the editor of the Survey Graphic magazine, pretending to celebrate a new book release by Jesse Fawcett. But it was a trap. Once the doors closed, the white publishers sat down to eat. Johnson and Locke unleashed a carefully chosen lineup of black literary genius. They trapped the white gatekeepers in a room and bombarded them with black excellence. The publishers were shocked by the talent. Paul Kellogg, the editor of the Survey Graphic, was so overwhelmed that he dedicated an entire upcoming issue exclusively to the black writers of Harlem. That single issue broke all of the magazine's sales records. Locke quickly expanded into the battle plan for the entire movement, a massive book that he called The New Negro. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Connie Cullen, Jeanne Toon, they were the new writers of a generation. Cartoons by Kane bent the rules of what black literature could be. They wrote masterpieces that forced the white mainstream to swallow the unfiltered truth about black life. We put our absolute excellence on display and made the white literary world pay top dollar to read it. While writers were conquering the publishing house, musicians were quietly taking over the global economy. White city dwellers didn't just come to Harlem to read books. They flooded the district every single night to go slumming. Thousands of white tourists traveled uptown to hear brand new electrifying sound called jazz. Mob-run clubs like the Cotton Club, an establishment that tried its best to keep Jim Crow alive. They enforced a strict white-only policy, forcing black customers out while black performers entertained the white elite. White mob bosses even forced the musicians to play in front of a fake jungle backgrounds. They called it jungle music. They thought that they were keeping black folks in our place. But band leaders like Duke Ellington orchestrated a bit of a trap. Duke Ellington knew that the mobsters had deep pockets, so he used their money to fund and train a massive orchestra. He took that insulting jungle music and arranged it with complex precision. More importantly, though, in 1927, Duke Ellington negotiated a live nationwide radio broadcast, wire to wire, from the Cotton Club. He bypassed the racist bounces entirely. He beamed black brilliance straight out of the club into the living rooms of millions of white households across the country, using more than 50 local radio stations coast to coast. Jazz was the rhythm of black power. By dominating the music industry, black creators dictated the global definition of what was cool. The money wasn't just staying with the white club owners. Underground, Harlem ran its own hidden economy. Black residents threw rent parties, charging white tourists and locals admissions for live piano music and bootleg liquor to keep their massive apartments funded. And musicians, just like Duke Ellington, would play at these parties. You couldn't convince the world that a group of people were inferior when the same people were actively writing the soundtrack of a global musical movement. While we were winning a cultural war, every revolution has a breaking point, and a bit of a civil war broke out over the master plan of the Harlem Renaissance. The conflict came down to one question: what are we making art for? Older leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP were pushing respectability politics. Du Bois openly stated that all black art must be strict propaganda to uplift black folks. He wanted to show the establishment that we could wear tailored suits and speak perfectly and act just like them. He wanted the art to be perfect and safe and easy for white liberals to swallow. But the younger generation, they hated this. Langston Hughes and Wallace Thurman and Aaron Douglas refused to play this respectability politics game. In 1926, they pooled together their own money to establish a bold, radical magazine. They called it Fire. They refused to write for rich elites about polite tea parties. They weaponized the gritty, unfiltered truth of the Harlem streets. Fire featured stories about street hustlers and blues singers and sex workers. Wallace Thurman wrote a novel called The Blacker the Berry and openly called out the hypocrisy of colorism within the black community itself. Langston Hughes dropped the ultimate statement, writing that younger artists would express their dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white folks liked it, great. If they didn't, that didn't matter. The old guard was terrified. They hated it. Du Bois despised the magazine. The mainstream black press literally wrote that fire should be tossed into a fireplace. But the younger generation did not care. They were building their own unfiltered reflection of black excellence, refusing to let white comfort dictate their reality. However, this war for respectability wasn't the biggest threat. The actual villain was funding. Revolutions require a massive amount of money. In the 1920s, major publishing houses and art galleries and grant foundations were completely controlled by white wealthy donors. If black artists wanted to mass produce their work in art, they needed white money. But that money came with a trap. White wealthy donors didn't want to fund modern intellectual art. They were obsessed with the idea that it was primitive. They wanted art that felt exotic, tribal, wild. Charlotte Osgood Mason was an incredibly wealthy donor who literally demanded that black artists call her godmother. She sat on a literal throne in Park Avenue apartment and put Langston Hughes on a $150 allowance. But the moment Hughes wrote about real working class struggles of black Americans instead of playing into her weird African drumbeat fantasies, she cut off the funding. Some artists changed their work to keep the lights on, but the true artistry was figuring out how to beat the system. Zora Neale Hurston secured a massive $200 a month contract from Mason. It was a staggering sum in 1920. That translated to almost $3,500 a month in pure cash to just travel and write. Mason demanded strict ownership over Thurston's work and wanted her to find primitive stories. Thurston played into this game flawlessly. She smiled, she cashed the massive checks, and used that donor's money to travel deep into the rural South and to the Caribbean. She used white folks' rules against them, documented authentic hoodoo and folklore before it could be erased. And later she wrote, "The eyes, they're watching God." She used the establishment's arrogance and deep pockets to fund her own black research. So what happened? Well, the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression hit. White money dried up almost overnight. The fancy publishing house contracts, they vanished. And the Harlem Renaissance lost its financial engine. Critics love to look back and say that the Harlem Renaissance failed because it relied too much on white approval and didn't actually solve any black issues. But that completely misses the point. The Harlem Renaissance proved that we couldn't wait for the system to validate us. That while fighting internal civil wars and dodging the traps of white money, these creators built their own table of black art and black music. They used this raw reality of black life and turned it into high art and made it the most valuable cultural product in America. They permanently broke this old Negro myth and replaced it with black cultural excellence that still has pop culture by the throat even today. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy. This has been One My Black History, and this has been the updated story of the Harlem Renaissance. Once again, we're taking those stories, we're remaking them, we're giving them a new twist, a new spin, less academic, more black empowerment. Anyway, I hope you like this. If you want to read more stories like this, I have a Substack. I write new articles every single week. They are separate from what I'm putting out here on my YouTube channel. Additionally, you can find all of my works at onemyhistory.com. I'd like to thank my financial contributors. Everybody, my day ones, I love you all. Thank you for what you're doing. I could not do this without you. I love you all. Peace.